I know we've been through this before, Mr. Red Oxide, but it seems like you're a bit of a liar. And do you know what we do to liars? I know you've seen what happened to your friend, Mr. Green. And we wouldn't want that to happen to you, now would we?
Your paints are filthy liars. All of them, in one way or another. But to be more specific, your paint lies when they're wet. It's a phenomenon known as color shift, that while paints are still wet, they look different to how they'll look when they're actually dry. And it's one of those things that I still get caught not taking into account when doing my mixes. So I'm going to explain 3 ways paints lie, and how you can deal with those fibs.
First though, let's meet my model friend that I'll be using for this video. It's the last month of the Alien Hives re-release from One Page Rules. I'm going with a Ravenous Beast as it'll fit into my skirmish force nicely. They've also been updated with some different weapon options, so I'm going with one of those. Then there's also the Hive Guardians with their chunky armor, the Hive Lord, cause everyone needs a leader bean, the Toxico Rex, which I have painted on this channel before, the Mortar Beast and the Artillery Beast, which are both brand new sculpts, and the Devourer Beast for something massive, why not? So, which of you is satin and which is matte? Tell me now. Tell me or I will spill you all out and let you dry, and I will find out that way.
The finish of paint is just one of those things that's almost impossible to tell while it's still wet, and can be a bit of an issue when you start using lots of different brands that don't all have the same finish. If you mix an ultra matte into a satin paint, how satin or matte is the final result going to be? Well, we won't know until it dries.
To do an example, I have a bunch of blacks on my palette. They're all from different brands, but they're all carbon black. Some are ultra matte and some are satin. But if I were to give these a spin, I'd have no way of knowing which is which other than the consistency. So I'm going to take a bit of each and fill in the black on my Ravenous Beast, just going from one black to the next and back, even letting them mix some on the model. While they're still wet, it's very hard to tell one apart from the other. But when they dry, we start to see a very different picture. We get some patches where it's really matte, and some where the light reflects off no problem because of its satin finish. And where they mix together, it's not quite one or the other. So the solution to this, when you're mixing different paints from different lines, is to use a medium as well for a finish that you know you want. I like my matte medium for this, of course, but any medium will help to make sure that the finishes are uniform while painting the model. Though if that doesn't affect your painting style, you can always just spray at the end to make it uniform that way. Mr. Red and Mrs. Yellow. Quite the pair, aren't you? When with Sir White, you clean up nice and let your vibrant colors show through, wet or dry. But with my associate, Mr. Black, you only seem to be vibrant while wet. How about I give you a chance to explain yourselves? Maybe even reward you with links to the Patreon for One Page Rules and Paintman Journeying in the description. Paint opacity is another one of their lies that can affect how to paint a model. And I don't mean just red and yellow in this, but even naturally super opaque paints like red oxide are affected. While they're wet, they always seem like they're going to cover way more than they do, because while wet, their pigments are all spread out and reflecting all sorts of light. But when they start to dry and fix into place, we end up with the different concentrations of pigment in different locations. So even the most opaque color that looks like it'll cover no sweat in one coat is going to be a bit patchy, which is why we solve this issue with a very apt idiom. 2 thin coats. By applying more coats of thin paint, those patchy concentrations of pigment start to even out, and it begins to look like one solid color again. But base coats isn't the only time this can be an issue. In the case of some colors, while layering, they look like they are way more concentrate than they actually are, and when they dry, they let way more show through than you expect them to, which is why the only solution is to add more layers. It's actually kind of how things like contrast style paints work as well. When painting them on, they look like they've covered everything under them. It's only when they dry that we see that, oh, maybe actually I could have gone heavier in some spots, because it's only when they dry that those pigments have actually properly clustered together. You think I wouldn't see you, did you? Thought you were safe with all those reds and oranges. But I caught you, didn't I? Didn't I? You filthy, lying umber. Color shift. The biggest problem with lying paints. Color shift is when, as the paint dries, it actually changes color a bit, either darker or lighter from what's in the bottle or tube, or what you've mixed up on the palette. And this is a problem because it sometimes really messes with how you plan to shade and highlight. So with this bone I mixed up, next to the base coat of the bone color, it actually looks quite bright on the palette. But when it fully dries, we can see that it's actually not changed from the underlayer that much at all. It's a combination of the underlayer showing through, but also that color shift of the paint itself. So what we actually have to do most times is make the mixes a little lighter than what we're actually aiming for, to make sure that they are the color we're aiming for. Adding that little bit extra can be the difference between satisfaction and a whole nother layer. But on the flip side, there's a point where thinned out paint or lighter colors actually dry brighter than expected. So what looks like no change at all actually becomes a big change once it's dry. I get this a lot when painting light furs. It looks like I'm not making any difference until that layer starts to dry. The reason I accosted the burnt sienna at the start is because it's one of those colors that kind of changes colors, along with the raw sienna as well. From the tube, they look very red, orange, and yellow respectively. But once dry, they actually appear more like the browns that they are than the color that they appeared to be. And we fix that with swatches. That's why swatching paints is an important part of getting a new paint set. It's what most do on the caps of them, though I personally like to swatch over the barcodes so I can also tell the opacity with the black and white lines. It gives us a real representation of what the paint looks like when it's dry, so that they can't lie to us with their labels or on palette tone. If you liked this video, please subscribe, and if you'd like to support my channel, check out my Patreon where I have new models and videos each month for you to print and paint.